The Pentagon revealed that the U.S. is reopening an air base in Thailand for the use of fighter bombers en route to Southeast Asia to bolster air-supported South Vietnamese forces. More firepower into Vietnam. This time it's a guided missile borne on a helicopter. The gunships are brought in from duty in Germany to help repel North Vietnamese tanks used in the spring offensive. Additionally, one of the Pentagon's top civilians, a weapons specialist, met with President Thieu today to discuss what the weapons the U.S. could give to South Vietnam to improve their posture. And 5 generals and admirals are making a survey of South Vietnam to see what can be done to bolster the South Vietnamese army with more sophisticated weapons.
It is 1969. President Richard Nixon, freshly in the White House, promises to end the war against communist forces in Vietnam. He is the 3rd president tasked with ending the war. As such, he also inherits the decisions of the Johnson administration. Amongst the most tragic are the U.S. soldiers taken prisoners of war by the North Vietnamese. Their stories will reveal the horrific truth behind treatment of P.O.W.s. Nixon's attempt to simultaneously reduce American forces overseas and to keep protesters at bay at home is poised to backfire. The next 2 years for the new president will find his authority and judgment tested in ways he may never have imagined. The North Vietnamese claim captured U.S. airmen shot down during North Vietnam bombing raids and missions are to be treated as war criminals. As such, they are not to receive the courtesies granted prisoners of war per the 1947 Geneva Convention, which North Vietnam had themselves signed. They refused to identify their prisoners to America, release the sick and wounded, and instead let them fester in unsanitary conditions. They also deny any inspection of their camps to outside parties. One such POW is a young Navy lieutenant, Paul Galanti. He is 26 when his plane is shot down on June 17, 1966.
It's tough to prepare for something when you don't know how long it's going to last. We'd gone to survival school, SEER school, survival, escape, resistance, and evasion. We'd gone to SEER school, and it's pretty realistic, except we knew in 3 days we'd be getting out and going back to the club or going back to the base. And so you can't simulate day after day after day after day after day after day after day, not knowing when it's going to end. And that was the toughest part. We couldn't train for that. We trained for the torture. We trained for evading questions. We trained for just about everything. They didn't teach us how to communicate covertly, which was, they do that now, but they didn't do it then. And but the training was okay. But none of us was ever going to get captured. I mean, you think about getting killed, that went with the turf back then. Being a Navy pilot was the most dangerous job in the world. It was more dangerous than steeplejacks or high steel workers. It was, we had a lot of accidents, operational accidents. I got shot down 6 months into cruise and into the combat part of the cruise, and we'd had 13 people killed at that point out of 80 combat pilots, which is pretty substantial numbers.
Galanti's ordeals start before even arriving at the prison itself.
Well, I landed about 100 miles south of Hanoi, and it took 12 days to get there because you couldn't travel in the daytime. We owned the roads, and the Vietnamese captured me almost immediately. I think they were going to shoot me. I was tied to just been dropping bombs on their houses a few minutes before, and not in their houses, but in the villages. And they didn't like us a lot. So, I mean, they turned the village loose on us. Little kids and women were coming up and beating us with sticks and throwing rocks at us. I said, it was just me initially, then 2 Air Force guys joined up.
Deprived of sleep, beaten, refused food, have their fingernails ripped out, are shot at and even burned by cigarettes. Many times they are practically starved, living off a diet of mostly rice. Not even allowed space to stretch, they're often locked in small cages or cuffed.
It was 20 by 15. There were 3 of us in it, but it looks like I'm in solitary in the room. The smallest was about 4 feet by 6 feet, and it included a bed that had about a foot down the side between the bed and the other wall to just kind of try and walk back and forth on 3 paces turn, 3 paces turn. That was the smallest one. It was 6 by 4 by about 14 feet up. And so they were miserable. Some of them had a concrete slab for a bed. Some of them had boards. The boards are much softer than concrete. And some of the concrete ones had stocks at the bottom, like the ones in Williamsburg, where they could lock your feet in.
The Nixon administration is vocal in demanding fair treatment of American POWs. The president meets with President Nguyen Van Chu of South Vietnam on June 8, 1969. The place is Midway Island. By the end of the meeting, Nixon has set the immediate withdrawal of 25,000 American troops. In a so-called goodwill gesture, North Vietnam releases 3 American POWs. They are Seaman Apprentice Douglas B. Hegdahl and Lieutenant Robert Frischman of the U.S. Navy and Captain Wesley Rumble of the U.S. Air Force. Hegdahl was knocked overboard from his ship off the Gulf of Tonkin on April 6, 1967.
He was a seaman apprentice. He didn't even go to survival school. He's on a ship, and it was a World War II cruiser and didn't have any air conditioning, so he's out in the middle of the South China Sea, and the temperatures inside that ship were 120 or 130 degrees, so the sailors would go out and sleep on the deck where it's only 80 degrees or 90 degrees, and he missed the general quarters call and was on the deck when they fired the big guns. He went right over the side and ended up swimming and swam for 12 hours and picked up by a Vietnamese fishing boat.
He's only 19 at the time. The Hanoi Hilton is just one of the sites of inhumane tortures and unendurable pain to the American POWs.
5 in the morning, they'd bang on garbage can lids. It's supposed to be a gong, but it sounded like it was just a real cheap garbage can lid. Wake us up, and then they'd play the Radio Hanoi, the English language version of it, on a PA system around the camp. About 10 o'clock, the first meal would come, which is usually a little crust of bread. It's some greens or pumpkin soup, which is just water and pumpkin or kale thrown into it, and a piece of bread or some rice. And then at 2 o'clock, the second last meal would come, and that was usually the same thing. And then at night, 8 o'clock at night, the camp radio would come back on again. It'd be a rerun of the English language broadcast, usually with the American traders, Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda, and the rest of them came over to pat the North Vietnamese on the back for defeating the U.S. aggressors. And that was it. That was the day. The rest of the time was the North Vietnamese, everybody, including the guards, would take siestas at noon, so that was a good time for us to communicate by tapping on the walls. And every opportunity we could, we tried to communicate with other Americans. But that was it. And if you had a couple or 3 guys to a room, you had something to talk about and refresh each other. I taught every roommate I ever lived with knows how to speak French now, or at least my version of it, which has more of a American accent than anything else. But so it was incredibly boring. The thing that kept us going was each other, and the fact that we weren't gonna cave in.
The Viet Cong also employ solitary confinement for prisoners for indeterminate lengths of time.
The absolute worst time for me was being in solitary and out of communication, which happened a couple of times. And And I really didn't like that. In fact, I'd prefer to get tortured and get it over with than go through 6 months of solitary. Well, longest, it's a lot longer than that for some. My longest stretch was 9 months. And about a year total with small groups. Because the trouble, you don't know what they are. I mean, you go in solitary, it might be, at the end of 2 days you might get out, or it might be, next time you get out is 5 years. Several of the senior officers were in solitary for 5 years.
Prisoners are also subjected to attempted North Vietnamese brainwashing and indoctrination. They are encouraged to write anti-American statements, statements used for propaganda purposes and to break the prisoner's will. Any chance of escape from a POW camp are slim. With communist forces in Vietnam weakened from the Tet Offensive, U.S. forces waged their own offensive to drive the North Vietnamese back and reassert Allied control over the A Shau Valley, a mile from the Laotian border. Strategically, the valley is an entry route into South Vietnam and close to the already ravaged city of Hue. American forces lost their presence in the valley in 1966 when the North Vietnamese overtook a Special Forces camp. Lieutenant General Richard G. Stilwell, 24 Corps commander, orders a campaign to stop the growth of North Vietnamese forces in the area before they gain too great a tactical advantage. The main commander of the 101st Division, Major General Melvin Zayas, sends Colonel Joseph B. Conmead, Jr. and his 3rd Brigade with the task of eliminating the pride of Ho Chi Minh, the 29th NVA Regiment. One fateful hill, Hill 937, stands apart from the others, towering at 3,074 feet above sea level. Covered in jungle and with elephant grass reaching several feet in the air, it is a natural setting for an ambush. The Vietnamese call it Dong Ap Bia, but it will quickly earn a new name, Hamburger Hill. May 10th, 1969, 1640 hours. Operation Apache Snow boasts 3 airborne infantry battalions of the 101st Airborne Division, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Brigades, under the command of Major General Melvin Zayas. Supporting them are 2 South Vietnamese battalions and 3rd Regiment, as well as the 9th U.S. Marine Regiment and 3rd Squadron, 5th Cavalry Regiment. The mission will be a reconnaissance in force, where the 5 units will helicopter in and stage a combat assault on any North Vietnamese troops and encampments. May 20th. The hill is practically denuded after an airstrike drops 1 million pounds of bombs and 152,000 pounds of napalm. At 11:45 hours, the Rakkasans are finally able to take the hill. Many of the North Vietnamese forces have fled, leaving only 2 platoons. Hill 937 is officially secured at 1700 hours. But at a cost. About 70 Americans are killed, with 370 wounded. The casualty rate is a staggering 70%. One trooper tacks a makeshift cardboard sign to the remains of a tree trunk. It reads, Hamburger Hill. Written beneath it by another soldier is one question: was it worth it? American criticism of the battle is fierce, with Senator Ted Kennedy at the forefront. Zayas and Westmoreland defend the mission, while the president's press secretary supports it. But still, Hamburger Hill forces an assessment of American tactics in Vietnam. Nixon orders General Abrams to conduct war with a minimum of American casualties. Hamburger Hill is abandoned on May 28th and quickly goes back into the hands of the Viet Cong. The battle and the loss of lives seems pointless to many. As his fellow Marines are wounded or killed in the fighting in Vietnam, Carlos Hathcock avenges them, with each target entering his sights. Hathcock, a gunnery sergeant, goes on to record 93 confirmed kills in Vietnam and will become the most renowned Marine Corps sniper of all time. For a sniper's kills to be confirmed, there must be an acting third-party officer, as well as a spotter. Hathcock's record indicates 93 confirmed kills. By his estimates, he killed over 300 in the Vietnam War. Hathcock had 80 confirmed kills in his first tour alone. For unconfirmed, he takes out an entire North Vietnamese company, as well as approximately 100 more enemy soldiers. Hathcock becomes legendary in their eyes. The white feather worn in his hat while serving on patrol under land earns him the nickname Long Chong by the Viet Cong, or White Feather. One of the Viet Cong's greatest snipers is a woman, known as the Apache Woman. This VC platoon leader is infamous for brutally and sadistically torturing Marines unfortunate enough to be captured by her platoon. Hathcock is working with Captain Land in her known area of operation. He sights her from 300 yards away. It would be easy to pick her off with his Model 70 Winchester 30-06, but that would still leave her entire patrol intact. Land and Hathcock call in mortar fire, and in the ensuing high-explosive barrage, the Apache Woman runs for cover. Unknowingly moving towards Hathcock, she is felled by one of Hathcock's bullets. He declares, "So feared is Hathcock by the North Vietnamese that they place a bounty for $30,000 on his head. Typical bounties do not go beyond $2,000. On September 2nd, Lieutenant Frischmann and Hegdahl, with the blessing of their superiors, reveal the truth about POW camps to the press, in spite of their northern Vietnamese captors' warning that if they embarrass them, they will get even against their fellow POWs.
The biggest conception about us, it was really nasty, brutal treatment. And there's 662 guys shot down, and probably all except about 20 of them fought the Vietnamese every step of the way from the time they got captured until they were released. And there are a handful of folks who cooperated. 12 of them came home early. Only one guy was ordered to come home early if he could, and the other ones were told not to come home or to fight going home, and they didn't. So the perception, they came out, all of this, the one who came out was a sailor who was captured illegally in international waters, and he was told if he could get out to do it. He didn't want to, but they released him, and he came back and traveled around the country blowing the whistle on them. I don't have any thought. I haven't run into any of them since we've been home. They can't belong to our organizations. They never come to our reunions. They were actually had court-martial charges put on them by Admiral Stockdale for the Navy and Marines, and the Army was an Air Force. They weren't the Air Force, but there was an Air Force officer who was kept with the enlisted Army guys, and he put charges on several of the Army enlisted. Both the secretaries, John Warner, our own John Warner, then, and Bo Calloway for the Army, decided to drop the charges. They're afraid it would just reignite the anti-war movement, and we initially didn't like that, but in hindsight, it's probably pretty smart to have done that. I don't think they would have been convicted anyway.
The same day the POWs reveal their tortures, Ho Chi Minh dies of a heart attack. He is 79. His death does not mark the end of the war in Vietnam, however, as he is replaced by a collective of ministers and military leaders. the North Vietnamese withhold news of his passing for 48 hours.
I believe that one of the reasons for the deep division about Vietnam is that many Americans have lost confidence in what their government has told them about our policy. The American people cannot and should not be asked to support a policy which involves the overriding issues of war and peace unless they know the truth about that policy. Tonight, therefore, I would like to answer some of the questions that I know are on the minds of many of you listening to me. How and why did America get involved in Vietnam in the first place? How has this administration changed the policy of the previous administration? What has really happened in the negotiations in Paris and on the battlefront in Vietnam? What choices do we have if we are to end the war?
President Richard Nixon, amidst a storm of public criticisms of his administration's handling of the war, takes to the airwaves to address the social unrest generated by the younger generation and to appeal to the World War II generation.
And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace. I have initiated a plan of action which will enable me to keep that pledge. The more support I can have from the American people, the sooner that pledge can be redeemed. For the more divided we are at home, the less likely the enemy is to negotiate at Paris. Let us be united for peace. Let us also be united against defeat. Because let us understand, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that. 50 years ago, in this room and at this very desk, President Woodrow Wilson spoke words which caught the imagination of a war-weary world. He said, "This is the war to end wars." His dream for peace after World War I was shattered on the hard realities of great power politics. And Woodrow Wilson died a broken man. Tonight, I do not tell you that the war in Vietnam is the war to end wars, but I do say this. I have initiated a plan which will end this war in a way that will bring us closer to that great goal, to which Woodrow Wilson and every American president in our history has been dedicated, the goal of a just and lasting peace. As president, I hold the responsibility for choosing the best path to that goal and then leading the nation along it.
9 days later, on November 12th, the American people learn of the My Lai massacre from the media. Seymour Hersh, an independent reporter, receives a tip from an attorney, which then leads to his uncovering the Army's indictment sheet against William Calley for the murder of 109, quote, Oriental human beings, unquote, at My Lai. An earlier military investigation had been started in April 1968 by Calley's own brigade, which claimed no evidence of foul play. Upon discovering this cover-up, the Army ordered a new investigation that placed 30 soldiers under scrutiny. 14 of them will find themselves charged, with only Calley found guilty. Convicted with life in prison, Calley will be released in 1974. Many of the other soldiers claim they were all just following orders.
And we've had so many of our troops currently that have gone and been prosecuted for doing their job. It's a real shame. I don't condone killing innocent people, but by the same token, if someone's carrying an AK-47, they need to be dealt with in a proper fashion.
President Nixon, during his 1968 campaign, promised to end the draft. Upon reaching office, he instituted a commission to study whether a volunteer army would be more or less effective than a conscripted one. On September 16th, he cancels draft calls for both November and December and reduces the number of new draftees by 50,000. It was a way to both lessen the amount of U.S. troops entering Vietnam and to hopefully quiet down the anti-war protests erupting across college campuses.
I was in my second year of college, and in those days we had the local draft boards, and of course the draft boards were taking all the high school dropouts. They were taking the fellows that weren't doing anything, and because the local draft boards had to meet a quota, they started taking college students, even though I had a deferment. They were after me, and what I did is I went down and enlisted in the Navy. And I went into a program that the Navy had called the Junior College Program. As long as you had signed up before the draft board could get you, you were excused. You had a letter from the Navy that when I graduated from college, I would go right into service.
For the first time since the American Civil War, U.S. Navy forces find themselves engaged in operations on rivers and other tributaries in Vietnam. As the Cold War caused a renewed growth in the Navy, Vietnam pushes the Navy to provide tactical support on the inner bodies of water. The river patrols, or Brown Water Navy, consist of river patrol boats or patrol air cushion vehicles, also known as hovercraft, that would patrol areas unable to be reached by their larger mothership. They are known as boots on the ground, engaging in riverine warfare with the enemy. No less important in combating a guerrilla is the need to seize the initiative and deprive him of the sanctuary offered by his remote jungle base camps, and to search out and destroy his main combat forces. Various types of river assault craft have conducted far-ranging combined operations with ground and air forces. These highly mobile forces, with their waterborne heavy firepower, troop lift, and support capabilities, have made an important contribution to the interdiction campaigns through rapid exploitation of enemy contacts generated by patrol units. The shallow draft coastal patrol craft have carried the battle to the enemy far up the rivers and canals opening to the sea on which river patrol or assault craft have not normally operated. The communist guerrillas can no longer depend on remote riverine areas to offer the sanctuary they once knew.
We were part of what they call the Brown Water Navy. We were actually what they call boots on the ground. We were kind of rare to hear, because most people think when you say you're in the Navy during the Vietnam War, they think you're out in the Gulf of Tonkin and you never made it ashore, but we were actually boots on the ground in Vietnam.
The Brown Water Navy's days are grueling as they traverse the waterways in search of enemy activity.
It was really very tiresome. Sometimes we go almost 72 hours without sleep. I was assigned to what they call an LST, which is like an old World War II ship. If you ever saw pictures when they had the landings in Normandy, they come ashore, the doors open up, they bring out the tanks and stuff like that. We would transport tanks, we would transport personnel, we would transport vehicles, food, ammunition, anything you can think of.
Also at play on the rivers are the patrol craft, also known as swift boats. The swift boats are largely responsible for intercepting movements of Viet Cong munitions and arms, as well as transportation of Vietnamese allies.
But our main job was to go through the waterways. We were also part of a swift boat group. We'd have swift boats tie up next to us who were patrol boats. And it was funny, we got a nickname, our vessel would be called Mother, and the swift boats looked like a whole bunch of little ducklings behind them. So we'd actually have to just constantly work while we're on the rivers. And you tried to work in teams. You had certain duties, certain things you had to do. When we made a beach landing, you were responsible for getting as much ammunition or food or supplies off as you can. During low tide, we'd beach at low tide, catch the high tide out. So we'd work around the clock.
The danger is not just relegated to the shores, but also underwater, as Roberts and his fellow crew members learn.
One of our biggest concerns were mines. When we were over there, they blew up the Westchester County, which was an LST, and they actually lost, I believe, it was something like 75 men on that thing. And so we're always concerned about mines or being minded and everything. And it got to a point that we do what they call sweeps. And what a sweep would be is your director of your 40mm guns, because they're electrically or electronically controlled, you would just keep sweeping back and forth, fore and aft, just to clean them out. And you take a 40mm and at that range and 6 of them firing at the same time, you just rip the earth apart. And they just didn't bother us after a while, so we don't know if we killed them. Some of the other things that we would be concerned about is when we're coming back into Da Nang one time, they had, it's called mostly like a mic boat. A mic boat would be like an LCVP. It has a big front door on it. You can put a small tank or small vehicle on it and drive it wherever you want and drive it ashore. As we were coming into Da Nang, they blew her up just as we were approaching her. And I think they had a crew of roughly about 10 on there, and I think half of them were killed.
Also included in the river fleets are patrol boats River, or PBRs. These small boats are first employed in Vietnam in March 1966 and soon grow to 250. These speedboats hold a 4-man crew. A PBR will be vital in the valor exhibited by Boatswain's Mate First Class James E. Williams on October 31st, 1966. Williams' PBR 105, along with another PBR, are seeking out Viet Cong guerrillas in the Mekong Delta. The Navy men are suddenly attacked by VC in 2 sampan boats. They eliminate one boat and pursue the surviving. It is a trap. The 2 boats are led into a hotbed of VC activity as the enemy opens fire with small arms and rocket-propelled grenades from positions on the riverbank. Despite the overwhelming numbers, Williams continues to lead his boats against the Viet Cong River forces. Air support from a UH-1B Huey-copter arrives, and Williams uses his boat's spotlights to reveal the positions of the enemy troopers. Williams' instructions to the pilot are clear and simple. The battle lasts for 3 hours, resulting in the destruction of over 50 Viet Cong vessels, the deaths of several VC soldiers, and the disruption of enemy operations. Williams, a 20-year veteran of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, is granted the Medal of Honor by President Johnson on May 15, 1968. His other awards include the Silver Star, Navy Cross, Legion of Merit, Navy and Marine Corps Medal with Gold Star, Bronze Star Medal with 2 Gold Stars, Navy Commendation Medal, Vietnam Cross of Gallantry, Purple Heart with 2 Gold Stars, Vietnam Service Medal with Bronze Service Star, National Defense Service Medal, UN Service Medal, Korean Service Medal, Korean Presidential Unit Citation, Korean War Service Medal, and Navy Good Conduct Medal. His citation reads, "Under the leadership of Petty Officer Williams, who demonstrated unusual professional skill and indomitable courage throughout the 3-hour battle, the patrol accounted for the destruction or loss of 65 enemy boats and inflicted numerous casualties on the enemy personnel. His extraordinary heroism and exemplary fighting spirit in the face of grave risks inspired the efforts of his men to defeat a larger enemy force and are in keeping with the finest traditions of the United States Naval Service." Working in cooperation with the Navy is the United States Coast Guard, which operates 26 Point-class cutters on the rivers as well. As U.S. forces were scaled back, these vessels were all donated to the South Vietnamese Navy as part of the United States' effort to hand the reins of the war over to the Vietnamese people. Also present to quash the North Vietnamese insurgency are the Navy SEALs, a new form of Navy soldier first envisioned by President Kennedy. May 25th, 1961. In the same speech in which John F. Kennedy promised a man on the moon, he also outlined a proposal to form what would eventually become the United States Navy SEALs program.
In addition, our special forces and unconventional warfare units will be increased and reoriented. Throughout the service, new emphasis must be placed on the special skills and languages which are required to work with local populations.
The allocated funds, over $100 million, go into developing the Navy Sea, Air, and Land Team, or Navy SEALs, in 1962. The force traces its beginning back to the closing years of World War II, when the U.S. Navy Scouts and Raiders School was founded. The teams were utilized in secret anti-communist operations in Cuba, and by 1962, the Navy SEALs are covertly at work in Vietnam. The Viet Cong fearfully call them the men with green faces, in reference to their camouflage face paint. The SEALs are a force to be reckoned with, extremely effective in anti-guerrilla and guerrilla operations, and taking from the Viet Cong what was previously safe territory for the enemy. Their ability to infiltrate enemy territory through unconventional warfare lends them an unpredictability and versatility that is unparalleled. With small, well-trained units, they get high-impact results in situations that would have been impossible by an infiltration of a larger force. They are the Navy's equivalent to the Army's Green Berets and are immediately deployed out to the waterways of Vietnam, disrupting the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese lines of communication and travel. 8 units of SEALs will act in Vietnam on a continuous basis through the height of the Vietnam War. By war's end, they will be responsible for 600 confirmed Viet Cong kills, and for most certainly 300 more unconfirmed.
The new guys, the cherries, and the old guys looked at us a little different. They didn't want to be near you. You didn't want to get to know the new guy's name in case something happened. Your main thing was just to get out of there.
Meanwhile, the Army hangs on with an ever-changing and stressed group of soldiers, with the initial and false belief that the war will be a short one. Soldiers are rotated through Vietnam on year-long tours.
I mean, the government flew me there, but I didn't go in as a unit. And your rotation was basically the same idea. You were there for your 365 days, and you were brought out as a unit, and it'd be a small unit, or you come out as an individual attached to a unit coming home. So, I mean, it was totally different for us.
For officers, only 6 months are spent commanding a platoon. Untested soldiers are put in inconsistent units with equally untested leadership.
It was a whole new experience for me. I didn't know what was going to happen. Every day was new. I knew I was going to get some physical workouts and stuff, and I was just a little skinny kid then, you know, and shy, and didn't know what to expect. And they kind of, you know, you had your drill sergeants, you had the good drill sergeant, the bad drill sergeant. Both of them were with the 1st Air Cav Division, and they would tell us all kinds of stories about how the Cav operated, and it was kind of scary, you know, and we figured I didn't want to wear that big yellow patch. Got sent out to my first base, got assigned to a gun, and kind of like try to fit in. But being what they call a cherry or a FNG was you were at the bottom. You know, you got all the lousy details, you got the jokes pulled on you and stuff. And you just hoped that that first night you survived it because it was spooky. You kept seeing things moving around out there at night, and you know, everybody's laughing at you because nothing, it was a bush.
The government's belief is that 1 year is short enough to prevent soldier burnout. This focus on the individual ignores the concerns of the unit and results in an inefficient force.
Like everybody says, you get the smell, you get the heat, you don't know what it is, you don't know what to expect. You see the guys coming home, and then you see the guys going, and you know, coming in country, and you know, you get the looks, you get the stare, you see how they react, how dirty they still looked, but they were happy to get on that plane, and that was the biggest thing. And all we kept thinking was, In 365 days, I'll be getting on that plane to go home too.
I think it was an eye-opener. Being from New York, I went to school and we were integrated with people. You didn't think anything different about them. And then when you get into the military and you meet some of the Navy personnel that's from the South and they have a different attitude towards the African Americans, it was a wake-up call. You really didn't believe that people were like that, because I was brought up in an environment that you treated everybody the same. You were equal. But a lot of the military personnel from the South had a different attitude about it. And I know even when we were in boot camp, you'd have your company commanders stress that everybody's equal here. He wouldn't tolerate it. If you were from the South and you didn't like someone that was an African American doing, they just wouldn't tolerate it. They would put it down immediately.
The military in Vietnam, much like the United States itself, is also dealing with racial strife between soldiers. A Navy base at Cam Ranh Bay faces sailors burning crosses and raising a Confederate flag. African-American prisoners at the Long Binh Army Stockade riot over a span of weeks.
I heard a few other instances of some troops, but I never observed any others. I went and served with a lot of other guys of color, but they all did their job.
You know, after Martin Luther King got shot, it seemed to segregate a little bit more. The black guys stayed on their side and the white guys stayed on their side. And we were kind of afraid to see what was going to happen. We got nasty looks. The guys that came in from the States were the ones that you had to watch out for. The guys that you were with all the while, you had no problem with. You know, we had everybody's back.
4 years earlier, in 1965, African-American soldiers represented 25% of the killed in action. 3 years later, African-Americans now make up nearly 12% of both the Army and Marines. While thousands of Americans fight for their lives in the jungles of Vietnam, the government is still determined to cripple the North Vietnamese presence in neighboring Cambodia, itself a country in political upheaval. March 18th, 1970. Prince Sihanouk of Cambodia is ousted by General Lon Nol, who orders the North Vietnamese out of the country while the prince is away. Sihanouk had been granting the North Vietnamese the right to set bases in his neutral country and virtual protection from the United States. The prince allies himself with the Cambodian communists called the Khmer Rouge. 2 days later, Nol's forces attack both the Khmer Rouge and North Vietnamese within Cambodia. He appeals to the United States for aid against the communist forces on April 14th. Nixon sees this as the ideal time to gain Cambodia and flush the communists from the country. If Cambodia comes in full possession of the North Vietnamese, not only will South Vietnam fall, but the U.S. forces entrenched in the country will be overtaken themselves.
And at that time, I warned that if I concluded that increased enemy activity in any of these areas endangered the lives of Americans remaining in Vietnam, I would not hesitate to take strong and effective measures to deal with that situation. Despite that warning, North Vietnam has increased its military aggression in all these areas, and particularly in Cambodia. After full consultation with the National Security Council, Ambassador Bunker, General Abrams, and my other advisors, I have concluded that the actions of the enemy in the last 10 days clearly endanger the lives of Americans who are in Vietnam now and would constitute an unacceptable risk to those who will be there after withdrawal of another 150,000. To protect our men who are in Vietnam and to guarantee the continued success of our withdrawal and Vietnamization programs, I have concluded that the time has come for action.
The action decided upon by President Nixon is illustrated by a large map board.
Now, faced with these three options, this is the decision I have made. In cooperation with the armed forces of South Vietnam, attacks are being launched this week to clean out major enemy sanctuaries on the Cambodian Vietnam border. A major responsibility for the ground operations is being assumed by South Vietnamese forces.
April 22nd, 1970. President Nixon begins preparing a secret invasion of the Parrot's Beak region of Cambodia, jointly with U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. Nixon believes this area northwest of Saigon still houses Viet Cong and North Vietnamese armies. Few in the government, beyond Kissinger and select others, learn of the plan until movement begins on April 28th. Not even Lon Nol is apprised. On April 30th, South Vietnamese forces cross into Cambodia on a search and destroy mission to the fleeing North Vietnamese. They are joined the next day by American forces for Operation Rock Crusher. 36 B-52s let 774 tons of bombs loose on the fishhook's southern edge. After 2 hours of barraging, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces invade the Kampong Cham province. 10,000 U.S. and 5,000 South Vietnamese troops move in with armored units and mechanized infantry. So far, casualties are light. That will not always be the case as the Cambodian campaign runs through July. Back in the U.S., another battle is brewing. May 1st, 1970, Kent, Ohio. Protesters and rioters come out of local bars and start breaking shop windows downtown on this night. A state of emergency is called, and the police use tear gas to break up the crowd of 120. The next day, Governor Jim Rhodes calls in the National Guard to control the swell of violence. May 4th, 1970. At 11 a.m., students gather in the Commons. For some, it is to protest the war in Vietnam and attacks in Cambodia. For others, even those who are apolitical, it becomes about the police state established by the rifle-wielding guardsmen. At 11:58, 96 National Guardsmen and 7 police officers form a skirmish line, standing side by side. There are approximately 1,800 students in the area. Some throw objects like bricks and rocks at the National Guardsmen. At 12:25, several National Guardsmen fire on the crowd. 4 people are killed and 9 are wounded. The country is stunned. Nixon, having jumped into the conflagration of Vietnam, struggles with the powder keg that is the next generation. It is his darkest period. May 9th, 1970. At 4:35 a.m., President Nixon, under the weight of social and media criticism, decides to take an early morning trip to the Lincoln Memorial. About 10 student protesters are staying in sleeping bags overnight at the memorial. President Nixon decides to strike up a conversation. As President Nixon tries to end the conflict in Vietnam, the country continues to grow restless with the government's handling of the war. As for the soldiers, over in those humid and brutal jungles, the truth about the war's toll on them is about to come to light.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.